What's up everybody, this is BR and I'd like to talk about my TF2 video on rebalancing weapons. This video has gotten a lot of comments and replies, and most importantly, a lot of those are criticisms. And I fucking love the fact that people are actually giving their own opinions. I mean, after all, that's what this channel was made for, to create discussion about games, especially if it's one of my favorite games of all time. And for this video, I'm going to be taking those comments into consideration, and try to iterate on my original video, because after all, some of these commenters do bring up good points, and I also want to clarify exactly where these ideas came from, because it seems that in the video it didn't really delve that deep into where my justifications for those ideas were, and instead of replying to every single comment with the same answer, I think it'll just be better to create another video. So without further ado, let's get started. So unsurprisingly, the Natasha changes weren't that popular, and that's because it did have some very big faults. Changing the weapon from a slowdown on target to greater knockback on airborne players did arise the criticisms that I kinda saw coming, but instead of changing the idea last minute, I just decided to roll with it to see what people's reactions would be, and unfortunately, I got the criticisms that I was expecting. And the main critique was that the knockback, while it was interesting at the very least, it did make heavy less effective and change its role to something a little bit too niche. The idea of combating airborne targets with knockback would be something that wouldn't really come up, it would be too situational. So a new rework is of course on the table, but I was still limiting myself to what exactly I wanted to put into that rework. My goal with the rework of the Natasha was to remove that annoying factor of getting slowed down. And the reason why is because TF2 has been slowly phasing out that kind of mechanic. The Sandman no longer stuns, and the Pyro's Air Blast no longer takes away your momentum. The Natasha is the last weapon that actually manipulates your movement, and getting slowed down by the Natasha just isn't fun to fight against. It's not overpowered, but it still shouldn't be part of the game, especially if we're following TF2's balance ideology, which I wholeheartedly support. So I think a better approach to the Natasha would have been instead to basically make it into a force of nature, but for the heavy. And the way that we end up doing that is by increasing the pellet amount of the minigun for every shot that it fires. Because the minigun is basically just a glorified shotgun, or at least that's how it is implemented in TF2. Of course, the drawback is a wider bullet spread, but for a class like the heavy, that isn't such a big deal. And this change would actually still complete the goal of the Natasha being an anti-scout, anti-aerial weapon. One, because the knockback would just naturally be increased because of the amount of hit scan pellets there are, and two, it would generally be easier to hit your shots with that wider bullet spread. Now Heavy's close quarters effective range is increased. And funnily enough, this actually completes Heavy's minigun spectrum when it comes to his kit. Would you sacrifice a little bit of your potency to have longer range? Then go with the Tomislav. Would you like something that's a lot more defensive and protective of your close quarter area? Go with a weapon like the Natasha. Or would you like the basic tried and true minigun? And I really do think that this change could actually benefit everybody now. It remedies the issue of the Natasha having a movement impairment ability, and it no longer pushes enemies away from Heavy's effective range. If anything, it makes his more effective range a lot more deadlier. And hopefully that just turns out well. Now I'm gonna have to agree with the airstrike actually being the weakest part of the video. It was really a lot of build-up just to add projectile speed on consecutive shots. I mean, it didn't really change anything about the airstrike. It would just be a buff, but I don't think it would actually be as consequential as I thought initially. But funnily enough, a commenter actually gave a suggestion that was basically what I was gonna say initially about the airstrike before I published the video. However, I decided not to put it in because I thought it was just gonna make it a little too overpowered. And that change was having the airstrike have a larger blast radius and less fall off, which I did think was a good idea, but then I was like, well, maybe that would just make the weapon a little too powerful. But seeing as the idea that I published along with the video wasn't that good, I think this actually might be a better route. So instead, let's give the airstrike a bigger blast radius, but significantly decrease its knockback. So that way, when you're in the air and firing consecutive shots in rapid succession, you don't just juggle players around whenever you hit them. It's also going to make it easier to hit those consecutive rockets. I would also like to reduce its fall off so it's a lot more effective when in the air, however I think that might just make it a little bit too powerful, so I'd like to hear opinions down in the comments. Finally, the most controversial change that I had was with the Phlegistinator. Many were confused on a lot of the decisions that I had to say about the Phlegistinator rework. So before I talk about more of the reworks that I would do with the Phlegistinator, I have to explain myself a lot more deep because I know that I didn't explain myself in my previous video. Many were confused as to why I was making the Phlogistinator so weak to buildings because that wasn't the issue. The main issue was that Medic and Pyros were just way too effective. Many suggested that the Phlogistinator should just not be able to be Ubered when activated. And as true as that might be, in fact I actually do agree that that would be a great way to rework the Phlogistinator. The reason why I didn't go down that route was because of consistency. In TF2, no other weapon that provides a buff on damage actually has a restriction on whether or not you could use it alongside with Uber. You have weapons like the Killing Gloves of Boxing, the Criticola, the Buff Banner. All of these have great ramp up in damage, yet they can still be used alongside an Uber. Removing that ability from the Flog would just make it feel inconsistent. And that's just the best way that I can put it. It's not the strongest argument in the world, but I like the consistency when I'm designing things. So I'm not going to be taking away the ability to Uber a flogged Pyro, even if it's actually a good nerf, because then you'd have to kind of nerf everything else as well. You're making the argument that you can't have an Uber and a damage buff at the same time. And I think that just takes away a lot of the fun out of the game. Mixing the most powerful things of each class kind of makes the game a little bit more fun, and taking away that from Medic, I just don't think it's fair for the Medic. Going back to consistency, the reason why I made the Phlogistinator so weak to sentries is to keep it in line with all the other laser-based primaries. Both the Cowmangler and the Pomson have 20% less damage on sentries. But the reason why I made the nerf on the Phlogistinator so harsh is because Pyros were really never meant to destroy sentries with their primary. Engineers are supposed to be the class that is strong against Pyros. Pyro is an ambush class, and Engineer prevents that. And while I do understand that the Flamethrower is not the strongest weapon against a sentry, when a Flog Uber goes to kill an Engineer, its sentry is pretty much a sitting duck at that point. And for an Engineer, that really fucking sucks. There's no real counterplay to it. If you try to repair your sentry, you die from the Phlogistinator penetrating through your sentry, killing you instantly. If you try to move your sentry out of the way, the Pyro can just run you down with a Phlogistinator. If you try using the Wrangler to try to at least slow down the Pyro from killing you, that's also a bad bet because a Medic's Uber usually lasts long enough for a Phlogistinator to destroy a sentry. At least by having the Phlogistinator weak to a sentry, even if you die from the bullshit that is Phlogistinator crits, you'll at least know that the Phlogistinator Pyro isn't going to be able to destroy your sentry, even with an Uber. And now you might be asking, well, what about the Homewrecker? How come the Homewrecker got buffed? And that's because if you're going to be running Phlogistinator Pyro and you really want to destroy a sentry, you're going to need to run that Homewrecker. And what this forces the player to do is to switch out of their Flog, and this gives the Engineer some time to counterplay. Because the Pyro is no longer spraying down crits, and can only really focus on a sentry, now a Phlogistinator Uber Pyro has to choose whether to go for the Engineer or to dedicate their time to destroying the sentry gun. And for this Engineer, those couple of seconds are pretty crucial for thinking of what to do next. So while I do understand that this might not be the best route to take with the Phlogistinator, I do feel like people were shutting down this idea a little bit too fast. After all, this is all just conceptual. We can't really see how it would look like in a game. But I will admit my one mistake, and that is forgetting about the Scorch Shot. Fuck the Scorch Shot. That is one of the weapons that I do think really needs a huge rework. Its only purpose is to deal knockback and be annoying. If anybody has any actual suggestions, please leave them down in the comment section below. I really don't know how I would rework the weapon, but, you know, I'd like to hear from you. Maybe I'll give my opinion in the next video. But as far as the Phlogistinator goes, I do believe that it needs an attribute removed where it can get damage from secondaries. It really isn't fun. The afterburn lasts default by 10 seconds. It doesn't have that same afterburn mechanic that the Flamethrower does, so it is pretty much free damage. But anyways, that's pretty much all I have for you today. What do you think about these revisions and this elaboration on my Pyro rework? Do you have any suggestions on other weapons that I should take a look at? Maybe I can give a unique take on. Please leave your opinion down in the comment section below. If you found this video interesting, like it if you like it, dislike it if you disliked it. If you'd like to see more content just like this, make sure to subscribe. And if you'd like to support me, I do have a Patreon in the description. Thank you so much for my fellow Patreons for supporting this channel, and I will talk to you later.